Good evening. I'm Alan Price, Director of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library and Museum. On behalf of all my library and foundation colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome all of you who are watching tonight's program online. Thank you for joining us this evening. I would also like to acknowledge the generous support of our underwriters of the Kennedy Library Forums, lead sponsors Bank of America and the Lowell Institute, and our media sponsors, the Boston Globe and WBUR. We look forward to a robust question and answer period this evening. You'll see full instructions on screen for submitting your questions via email or comments on our YouTube page during the program. We are so grateful to have the opportunity to explore key issues before this fall's election with our distinguished guests this evening. I'm now delighted to introduce tonight's speakers. I'm pleased to extend a warm welcome back to E.J. Dionne, who is Washington Post columnist, a government professor at Georgetown University, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution, and a frequent commentator on politics for National Public Radio and MSNBC. The author of many books and editor of many more, his most recent book is Code Red: How Progressives and Moderates Can Unite to Save Our Country. I'm also delighted to welcome back Janet Hook, a staff writer covering national politics for the Los Angeles Times. She returned to the Times Washington Bureau in 2018 after spending 8 years covering politics and Congress for the Wall Street Journal. She had previously covered Congress and politics for the Times from 1995 to 2010. She has also served as a John S. Knight Journalism Fellow. Welcome also to Kimberly Atkins, a senior opinion writer at the Boston Globe. She is also an MSNBC contributor and has previously served as the first Washington-based news correspondent for WBUR, the Boston Herald's Washington bureau chief, guest host of C-SPAN's Washington Journal, and a Supreme Court reporter for Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly. She's appeared as a political commentator on numerous television and radio networks, and before launching her journalism career, was a trial and appellate litigation attorney in Boston. Finally, I'm so pleased to welcome Karen Tumulty, our moderator for this evening's discussion. Welcome her back virtually to the library this evening. She is a columnist for the Washington Post, where in her previous role as a national political correspondent for the newspaper, she received the Toner Prize for excellence in political reporting. She has also served as a national political White House and congressional correspondent for Time magazine and covered a wide variety of beats for the Los Angeles Times. Please join me in welcoming our special guests.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us this evening. This is actually the second time we've done a forum like this. Kim is joining us. Before we had Ron Brownstein with us, but otherwise it's the same old panel. And I was looking back, the last one we did was on May 19th. On May 19th, in some ways, it feels like nothing has changed. Coronavirus cases were spiking. You know, people who could work at home were stuck at home, and we're so grateful for our essential workers and our first responders. The country was in a state of high anxiety over the election. So we talked a lot about some of the issues that we'll be talking about tonight, but so much has changed since then as well. Now we have a Democratic nominee, a Democratic vice presidential nominee. We talked a lot about that in May. We've had two conventions that weren't really conventions. We've had a debate that wasn't really a debate. And most extraordinarily, and I think profoundly, what has shaken the country was that 6 days after our last forum, George Floyd was killed in Minneapolis, bringing to the fore just a lot of activism, a lot of issues that the country really had to confront. So I wanted to ask each of my fellow panelists here, as you look out here, voting has already started. Election day seems like almost a quaint concept. Voting is already underway. We're seeing record numbers of people already showing up to vote. The election may not be over on election night or election week or the week after that. So as you look out there, what do you think is happening? And how about you, Kim? Thanks for joining us.
No, thank you for having me. Yes, it's really an extraordinary time to see how, as you framed it so perfectly, how in some ways nothing has changed in the last several months, and in other ways everything has changed. I mean, you could not have predicted the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which exploded far beyond criminal justice reform and really turned into a nationwide reckoning about systemic racism in our nation, which is one of the biggest issues that is driving this tremendous early voter turnout. And you're right, I call it election season now and not election day, because people have been voting for weeks. I myself have already voted. I mean, it's an entirely different world. But at the same time, we're still in this pandemic. We're at the same place we were early in the spring. We're seeing numbers rising and preparing for the worst again when it comes to this pandemic. And now just a little over 2 weeks away from the end of election season, when people at least are done casting their votes, and you say, we don't know when we'll get those results. So I can just speak to me as a journalist. I am looking at all of these issues, and one of the most important things I think for journalists to do is to tell our readers and viewers and listeners, prepare them that election night won't necessarily be the same kind of an election night that we're used to. We may have an idea of who in the presidential race may reach 270, depending on how things go, but we might not. There will certainly be a lot of down ballot races from the Senate on down that won't be decided on election night, as we have to wait for those ballots to be counted. I mean, tens of millions of people voting early by mail or in person. That's just going to create a brand new situation for local election officials around the country who are just trying to manage this. And then there will also be the attempt by some, including the president perhaps, to try to call into question the legitimacy of the election, of the count, and try to disparage it. So there's so many moving pieces that we, as the folks who report on it and analyze it and opine on it, we have a duty to really be clear and help people get ready for what's to come, including all of the uncertainty that's a part of that.
How about you, Janet? What are you watching?
Well, one thing about this entire year, but you just looked back to May and said a lot of things remain unchanged, and that's true. But really, there have been so many shoes dropping along the way that sometimes do and sometimes don't affect the trajectory of the race. Actually, mostly not. This has been a remarkably stable race between Biden and Trump if you just look at the polling. But the atmosphere and the climate of the debate is so different. And beginning with, as you said, the death of George Floyd, and this whole resurgence of a debate that we've just not seen, all within the confines of a pandemic shutdown. And the course of the coronavirus has been kind of in fits and starts, and counties and cities and states have responded in fits and starts, and it just keeps spreading. And so you were pointing out we had conventions like we haven't had, not a real convention, we had not real debates. But when we had the first debate between Biden and Trump, I mean, that was a shoe dropping that I think really did change the debate. It was a debate like we'd not seen, just because President Trump behaved like a president has never behaved in a debate before. And then hard on that, he comes down with COVID-19. And so my biggest question looking ahead to the next 3 weeks is, what are the other shoes that are going to drop? As I said, the race has been remarkably stable, and it may remain remarkably stable. But it's funny because it's so hard to game out the final stage because of all the uncertainty. But also, sometimes I look at the polls and I say, oh man, this could be really close. You look at, in Michigan and Wisconsin, Biden's ahead, but it's by margin of error. It could really be a nail biter. And then other times I look at the polling, I say, oh man, this is a landslide in the making. So it's kind of like a kaleidoscope. I look at it this way one day, I look at it this way another day. And the good news for a journalist is it kind of keeps your eyes and ears open. And I think that's really what we have a responsibility to do at this stage, is just to kind of see what's happening, do our best to judge how it affects the climate for voters. And really, I personally am just eager to see what happens.
So what do you think, EJ, landslide or squeaker?
If I had to bet, I'd bet landslide. But what I was going to say is that the world is divided into two kinds of people. People who look at the numbers say these numbers look awfully good for Biden and they could be a landslide. And the other kinds of people who say, didn't we say something like that about Hillary Clinton 4 years ago? And almost every political discussion about, pundit style political discussion comes down as a war between those two things. So one of the things I've been trying to think about is what is different now than then? And there are a few things that are, I think, clearly different. One is the polling is better. Pollsters themselves said that they underestimated the number of non-college whites who are going to be in the electorate in the swing states. They also underpolled in the swing states. They didn't really pay careful attention there. There is plenty of polling in the swing states this year, including what's now become the extended swing states. So that's one thing that's different. The second thing that's different is that there isn't the same hostility to Joe Biden this is measurable than there was to Hillary Clinton. Earlier today, I was at an event where we unveiled a poll by PRI, which we do some work at Brookings with PRI on some of these surveys. And what's really striking is in 2016, the same kind of poll at this point in 2016 showed many, many more Trump voters were saying they were voting for Trump to vote against Hillary Clinton. And so I think the identity of the two, there's also no sexism, obviously, against Joe Biden, although there is some against Kamala Harris this time. And so I think that is a major difference. And then the third is the pandemic, where I think Trump was already in trouble. As Janet suggested, I looked the other day, and if you look at the Real Clear Politics average, as far back as they bring it, which is September of last year to now, Biden's been ahead the whole time in the Real Clear Politics average. The margin has changed, but he's had the lead. But the pandemic and Trump's handling of it has clearly taken a bunch of voters who might have voted for Trump again and just pushed them over the side. The last thing I would say is we've had several events that could have changed the trajectory and haven't yet. The conventions often change the trajectory of the race, and it did not appear that anything that happened at those conventions fundamentally altered the race. The choice of VP could have altered the race, and it didn't. And in fact, I think that says something good about Kamala Harris, because Biden had the lead. You didn't want the VP choice to mess up the lead. The VP choice didn't mess up the lead. Third, you had debates, and the presidential debate was an opportunity for Trump, and instead, it led to shifts against him. I think we can now say that event hurt Trump by several points, and also was a lost opportunity. The Harris-Pence debate probably helped Biden, the Biden-Harris ticket some, but at the very least, it surely didn't change the trajectory. And we might look back and say Trump getting the virus might have been decisive, because he cannot win this election without moving the voters' focus of attention away from the virus. If it's an election about the virus, Trump loses. He was having some luck moving the focus of attention. That brought it right back to the virus. And I don't know what he can do on Thursday. I mean, this is his last shot. He's lost several opportunities to change the trajectory. I heard one person who's in that second group that, will look what happened to Hillary, say, Biden peaked too early. Trump still has 2 weeks. Well, maybe. But Thursday, I think, is his last shot of changing things.
So Kim, Janet, I mean, we've been here for 15 minutes, so I haven't checked, but I think the debate's still on for Thursday. What do you guys think? Can this be a game changer for Trump?
I don't know if it can be a game changer, but it's certainly he needs that debate a whole lot more than Trump does. And last I heard,
Biden does.
Trump needs it more than Biden. Yep. Yes, sorry, did I get that backwards? Trump needs this much more than Biden does, and yet his campaign today was kind of throwing a wrench into the works, saying we want the topic to be different. So maybe they've calculated that he has more to lose by putting on another performance like last time. Because it's hard to see, having once approached this debate with a jackhammer, it's hard to see him coming in and trying a whole new tack. I mean, that is Trump. That is Trump. And the other thing, when EJ was ticking through the ways in which this year is different from 2016, another one that I think is really important is the fact that, according to polls at least, there are a lot fewer undecided voters. So that it was in 2016, a lot of the larger group of undecideds cut towards Trump. And so when this debate happens, it's just not clear that there are that many minds to change.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point, that there aren't a lot of undecideds. This is a turnout election. And what Donald Trump is going to need to do is to try to get as many people as he can who support him to turn out on election day, because in part based on his own disparaging of mail-in voting, the vast majority, according to a recent Pew survey, shows that the vast majority, 2/3 of people who will vote on election day say that they are voting for Trump, whereas more than 2/3 of people who are voting early say that they're voting for Biden. So if you need a clear reason why Donald Trump has been waging this war against mail-in voting, that gives it to you right then. And so what Donald Trump has to do is to get his supporters galvanized, get them energized, and get them out to polls on election day. And everything he's doing up until now is trying to do that with the rallies and his approach to debate. Donald Trump is also someone who has always listened to his own gut first when it comes to elections. And it worked in 2016. And so he's very disincentivized to listen to his advisors now who say, hey, the coronavirus, catching it gave you an opportunity to be empathetic to what voters are going through. No, he wanted to come out in a Superman shirt out of Walter Reed when he was discharged. And was somehow managed not to do that. But that's his idea. So the idea that he is going to approach this debate any differently, I think it is unreasonable. But taking a step back to the polling, one reason why I am still very wary about polling as opposed to mathematics is I remember in 2016, yes, he had this polling that was showing that Hillary Clinton was going to win, but in the lead up to the election, the last couple stories I wrote at that time as a reporter was looking at the math and looking at the Electoral College and laying out all the ways that Donald Trump could win, could get to 270 on election day, and there were multiple ways that he could get there, and he in fact found one of those ways. So that in the next 2 weeks is the exact same thing I'm going to be doing and looking at it in that way as opposed to polling, because at this point 4 years ago, we didn't know where the polls were under polling. We didn't know what the variables were. We knew after the fact that non-college educated white voters were undercounted. We knew after the fact geographically where it was undercounted. We don't know yet. And with the pandemic, with record early voting numbers, I haven't seen really great polling when it comes to voters of color. There are too many known unknowns, with apologies to Rumsfeld. There are too many known unknowns right now to look at this in any other way than looking at the electoral map, looking at what could happen and sort of plotting that out moving forward. But one thing I think that we do know is that Joe Biden is going to continue to be Joe Biden, and Donald Trump is going to continue to be Donald Trump in the next 2 weeks.
The way I look at the end is remembering the name James Comey, which is very, very important. And if you looked at the national polling was actually broadly right in that race. If you looked at the polling the day before Comey issued that statement, that letter, Hillary Clinton was ahead by 5.9, I think 5 and change. A week later, she was ahead by 2.9, and she won by 2.1 in the popular vote, which wasn't distributed right for her, and Trump drew his inside straight in all those swing states. So one question I keep asking myself is there possibly an event like that that could hurt Joe Biden in the same way? And again, I think that you could say that Hillary Clinton suffered for everyone else's sins, because I think there's much more watchfulness in this election about last minute stuff coming out. You're seeing that with the treatment of that crazy Hunter Biden story and the way it was reported, and what is that about? But I think there's much more wariness of last minute interventions like that this time. In terms of debate, which is what you asked about, I thought the 2 town halls were way more useful to voters last week than I ever expected them to be, because Trump's behavior and Savannah Guthrie's very tough questioning really showed us again that Trump can't make this pivot, which is what both Janet and Kim were suggesting, and that Biden's not terribly exciting in the weeds wonkiness ended up looking like he cared about the voters' problems. And I think Biden does not want to be shaken off that. And Trump has to try something different, but I don't think he can. I think it'll, I think his only hope is to mobilize some new voters to the polls. That's what he's hoping to do.
Well, so Kim mentioned too, there were a lot of things about the 2016 election that we only found out about after the fact, flaws in polling, that sort of thing. Another thing that we found out after the fact was the degree to which disinformation could be spread on social media platforms, across the internet. I recently did a piece where I tracked one misogynistic slur against Kamala Harris that began on—
Oh, that was a beautiful piece, by the way. Everybody should read this. And I've said that even when I wasn't on a Zoom call with you.
But it was something a guy sort of randomly wrote on his personal Facebook page. It gets picked up, rewritten, spread across blogs on everything about people who are interested in end times to people who are interested in motorcycles and in the end, it is the doctored version of it is viewed 630,000 times on the internet. And when you look at platforms like Facebook, they are completely impenetrable. You don't know what is out there spreading. So, and we've seen like doctored videos that make Joe Biden look as though he's non-compos mentis practically. I mean, how much of a factor do you think that could possibly be? Any of you? I mean, EJ says Trump needs to shake this up with something new. I mean, how big of a factor might this be?
I don't know. It seems that the fallout from the what we've learned about the disinformation in 2016 is this sort of heightened vigilance, both on the part of voters and social media platforms. But now it's become itself a subject of the kind of polarized debate that we have. Twitter and Facebook do something, and Trump says, "Oh, it's just because you're pro-Biden." I do think that was part of the power of the debate, and I agree with EJ about the town hall meeting, that it was in some ways more instructive than the debate, because you actually got to hear both of them if you toggled between the channels. But there was such a pervasive portrait of Biden as being a, doddering, forgetful, inarticulate old man, that when he shows up and actually, presents as an intelligent man who can put together a good sentence, he is who he is, and he's not a doddering guy without his marbles. On the other hand, I think the power of Trump's performances, when you see it in snippets, like the way we do on news, or you just see a quote, you don't get quite the full effect of Trump. And when he has been on these stages, there's no social media version of that can, that puts it in front of voters in a way that social media snippets designed to make him look bad are not nearly as convincing as his own performance.
Yeah, I'm not as optimistic as Janet. I think that social media platforms present a huge problem, and I don't think that they have been as vigilant as they could be in really stamping out disinformation, not only just false information that is put out, but the ability of groups, things like QAnon and other conspiracy theories just to thrive and grow. Just from talking to folks at some of these social media platforms, the problem isn't just the information. The problem is these platforms are built with these algorithms that are designed to bring people together with common viewpoints. And what that ends up doing is actually, when you have these groups, these groups don't say, hey, we're crazy conspiracy theorists. They have other names. But once they start finding each other on Facebook, the Facebook algorithm actually pushes them and suggests other conspiracy theory-minded groups for them to join. And then you have these folks coming together, and that's why you get to see all of these man on the street interviews that you see from media organizations of folks really genuinely saying that they believe that Democratic public officials are running a pedophilia ring through the U.S. government. Just really, really conspiracy theories that are mind-blowing. And so I don't underestimate the power of that, the amount of pushback that I, and I'm sure a lot of other folks get, members of the media get from these folks who push back anytime that we mention, actual things like systemic racism, and they push back saying that doesn't really exist, and why am I ignoring the pedophilia ring? I'm very concerned about that. I'm very concerned about disinformation that is being fomented and pushed on U.S. soil. I'm very concerned about disinformation that is coming from abroad, that these companies without real enforcement from the federal government, which is disincentivized to do anything about it, to really hold them accountable. So I think there's going to be another postmortem of this election to see the extent that kind of interference, election interference, has played in this election. And I think it's really concerning.
Well, and as EJ points out in his column that was in this morning's newspaper, some of this crazy conspiracy stuff is being spread directly by the President of the United States, who last week was retweeting just, an insane theory that Osama bin Laden isn't really dead, and that somehow there was that Obama and I don't know who else killed SEAL Team 6. And this is the president, and when he was pressed on that by Savannah Guthrie in the town hall, he said, well, I just retweeted that.
Right. No, it's very disturbing. Thanks for mentioning the column. One of the things that this sounds like to me is a lot of the stuff that was floating around on the far right back in the 1960s. We always think of the left 60s. We always forget the far right 60s, which may have a longer shelf life. The John Birch Society, the Minutemen, the White Citizens Councils in the South. And what's different now is that these theories that were marginalized by they didn't get a lot of coverage in the mainstream media, and the mainstream media is basically what you had. And they got around. There was a much more of a conservative right-wing media than most people realize. There were book publishing houses. Phyllis Schlafly set up her own book publishing house, but it wasn't out there in everybody's face, literally, the way these new groups are. And it's amplified, obviously, by new right-wing media, and it's amplified as Kim suggested, online. And now it's amplified by the president. I think there's a kind of push-pull between Trump and this stuff, which is these groups were part of his original base, but then he amplifies what they say. And it is really remarkable that he considers them enough of a part of his base that he won't condemn them. He says of QAnon, well, I know they're against pedophilia. They fight really hard against that. And I wrote in the column, it's like saying of the Ku Klux Klan, well, I know they love the American flag. They fight really hard for the flag. I mean, you know, it's kind of crazy, but you've really got this interactive effect going on right now.
Yeah, no, it really, it kind of crystallizes where Trump thinks that the rest of the campaign is. He really is not reaching out to any other voters than his base. In fact, he's almost making his base smaller. I've actually had talked to a Republican who said the net effect of the Trump presidency is to make the Republican Party smaller. And at this point, he's making it sort of minuscule. And, you know, his only hope is that swing voters don't notice him saying this wacky stuff.
So, Janet, that is a perfect transition to the next thing I wanted to bring up, which of course is that the top of the ballot isn't the whole ballot. And when we had our discussion in May, you and EJ were, I'd say, a little further out than I was on the chances of the Democrats picking up the Senate. What do you think now? And for all three of you, which races are you watching most closely as kind of bellwethers? You know, if this one flips, it's gone.
Well, it's I'd say much more likely now than when we last talked that the Senate is going to flip to the Democrats. And the question is really whether it's really close or they get up to 55 or some larger number. They really have suffered from Trump's decline. And the fact of the matter is there just aren't a lot of ticket splitters left in this world, so that there aren't people who, you know, kind of are alienated from Trump, but, you know, vote for a Republican senator. And the thing that's been really interesting to watch is you can watch the Republican Party almost in real time coming to this realization themselves, because for most of the Trump presidency, the Republicans in Congress have been lockstep with Trump. They would like ignore the question if they were asked about some of his more controversial things about, you know, kind of clearing Lafayette Square or, you know, the latest wacky tweet. And they just stood by him through thick and thin. The payoff came when they got another seat on the Supreme Court. But now you can see the kind of fear in their eyes as they kind of begin to distance themselves from Trump. Many of them are now campaigning on the theory, almost on the assumption that Trump is going to lose, by saying, you must reelect me and a Republican majority in the Senate, or there will be nothing standing between us and socialist Armageddon. So you see it in their behavior that they are expecting to lose control. Now, some of the bellwethers are like North Carolina. Tom Tillis is like totally dependent on Trump's success. If Trump loses, North Carolina goes. The North Carolina Senate seat goes. But I have to say, I'm also really interested in some of the peripheral races that have come into play. Like, I cannot believe that the senator from Alaska is actually getting a run for his money. I mean, the ripple effects of Trump's implosion are reaching pretty far and wide.
Yeah, I think that's really true. I mean, look at the fact that fundraising in the Senate races has just exploded on the Democratic side. And I think that is one big backlash to Mitch McConnell's push to get a Supreme Court nominee through before the election, has been the resulting fundraising that has gone to Senate races throughout. I mean, I think 4 years ago, I remember asking Senate Democrats when Merrick Garland's nomination was stalled, are you going to make this an election issue? How are you going to explain to voters how important this is, how important the Supreme Court is? And I got a lot of, mumbling and bumbling, and there just was no plan on the part of Democrats to really prioritize this. And it really took the Supreme Court being shifted so far to the right in all of the issues that entails to really wake people up. It took the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg to really get the Democrats to focus on how important the Supreme Court is. And I think there was already the shift on the Senate, but I think that is the thing that has really motivated and pushed people to give these Senate races such a strong look. I think that's probably the death knell for Susan Collins if she had a chance. I think this confirmation is reminded of her role in helping to confirm Justice Kavanaugh as well. And just the fundraising has just been really remarkable. That is something that I wasn't expecting in Senate races. And I was really, I was unsure. I hate making predictions anymore. But the one prediction I will make is I do believe that Democrats will take the Senate. And the question is, by how much? And I think the Supreme Court battle, while that will be, not just the Supreme Court, but all of the judiciary, shifting it so far to the right will be one of the, that will be the legacy of Mitch McConnell. I think that his days as Senate Majority Leader are numbered, and he knows that.
Well, and,
I think the Barrett nomination, could I just say real quick, because I agree on the Senate stuff, who knows, there could be, we could list all the races out there, but I think we agree on what the races are. Just on the Barrett nomination, I think it will be a moment in history that the Supreme Court fight shifted from being a conservative thing to being a progressive thing. That ever since Bork, that was the date conservatives used, but really going all the way back to Nixon, Republicans and conservatives have been bashing a liberal court forever. The combination of Merrick Garland and this nomination right before an election, I think, has had an electrifying effect on liberals. I think if it's voted on before the election, it will have a turnout effect, particularly on younger voters who really I think are very tuned into this fight. And Barrett is clearly not on their side, not on the preponderant side that young people are on. So I think this is the beginning of a new fight as much as it is the end of an old fight.
Yeah, Kim mentions fundraising. I mean, and then we see this jaw-dropping fundraising number in South Carolina, of all places, for Jamie Harrison, the challenger to the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee.
He could fund the Alaska Democrat on the side. He's got so much money,
These Democrats really are getting to the point where they have so much money they don't know what to do with. I mean, some party operatives are advising donors, like, don't give to Senate races anymore. We have other needs, but South Carolina was really the most implausible battleground this year because Lindsey Graham had been skating to re-election. They haven't elected a Democrat statewide in 20 years, and Jamie Harrison wasn't especially well known, but he became sort of a poster child for the challenge that Democrats were posing across the board, but especially in the South. I mean, I do think that Democrats are starting to see the changing South is creating some political opportunities for them in places like Georgia and North Carolina. South Carolina, not so much. So it's still a tough race for him to win, but it sure as heck isn't going to be because Jamie Harrison doesn't have enough money.
Well, and you had mentioned North Carolina and Tom Tillis and his argument that as several other Senate Republicans are starting to make, that maybe voters will vote split ticket. They'll vote for, as Tom Tillis said, he said, North Carolina voters really like checks and balances. So I decided to go back and look at the last time that North Carolina had voted one way in a presidential race and another way in a Senate race. It was 1968 with Nixon and Sam Ervin. I don't know. This seems like a rather thin read for Tom Tillis to be leaning on. And 2016 was the first time in, I believe, our history where there was not a single state in the country where a Senate race went to one party and a presidential race went to another. I mean, it's just partisanship is, driving things, I think, unlike we've ever seen, which gets me to my next transition, which is I wanted to talk a little bit about, it's not just candidates on the ballot, there are ballot initiatives. And in some ways, as someone pointed out to me today, that people should keep their eye on ballot initiatives, not just in their own state, but in other states, because often these movements in the states are just a picture into our future nationally. We certainly saw it with gay marriage, the backlash to the ballot initiatives in 2004 and 2008. In California, in the wake of George Floyd, there's an initiative to bring back affirmative action. But there are also some really interesting initiatives that are trying to figure out a way to fix our politics, whether it is with taking the drawing of district lines out of the hands of politicians, or setting up systems of ranked choice voting where you don't just vote for one candidate or the other, you list them according to preference, which the assumption is that would force every candidate to appeal beyond their bases. So Kim, could you talk a little bit about ranked choice voting and commission redistricting and what that says to you?
Yeah, so I mean, one thing, and so yes, ranked choice voting is on the ballot in Massachusetts. It has already been in use, I believe, in 4 states during the presidential primaries, and it's used in some other municipalities. Maine has it, and they're using it, I believe, for the presidential race for the first time. It wasn't in the primary, but they're using it for the first time in the election in 2 weeks. That is something that's coming up, which, like a lot of these initiatives, comes from at times of frustration of lack of action in state legislatures. Well, state legislatures can have the same kind of gridlock that we see in Congress. And a lot of these ballot initiatives you see were presented as bills, but they didn't get the action. And so the people who are proposing them get the number of signatures that they need to put these issues directly to voters. And something like ranked choice voting, I remember talking about it as a C-SPAN guest host. We did a segment on it several years ago, and it was really the first time that I was really hearing about it, but it's pushed by a lot of grassroots organizations as a way to give voters a greater choice so that you're not taking the lesser of certain evils that you see, or trying to strategically vote for someone because you know that your candidate won't win. You can rank them and you can actually pick the candidates of your choice. And given now that we're talking more after the really brutal primary that Democrats had, I think this is probably a great time for people who are voting for Joe Biden, will back Joe Biden over Donald Trump, but who wouldn't have, for whom Joe Biden wasn't their first choice. It's a way to try to get a better consensus candidate to emerge out of these races. And so I think that's a great example of that. We will see how that goes. But yes, other things too. I mean, in places like Virginia, where there is a ballot initiative to create a separate commission to do redistricting so that the state legislature is not in charge of redistricting. We've seen state legislatures historically be in charge of that, and that lead to this kind of gerrymandering that has led to a lot of problems and a lot of litigation, particularly in southern states with voter suppression. In Virginia, for example, it's an example of when you take something like this out of the legislature, how complicated it is. Actually, Black lawmakers in Richmond are against this plan because they think that it still gives state lawmakers too much power, and it's not completely independent. And so voters are going to have to sort through all that and come to a decision. So there are drawbacks to state initiatives. But yeah, we're seeing that as an important and growing issue. I mean, and we recall that it was Proposition 8, a state initiative that led to the Supreme Court decision that legalized same-sex marriage. So these are important things that voters are going to have to sort through, not just the presidential and other down ballot races, but these amendments and constitutional amendments that are on the ballots across the country.
Karen, I just want to underscore one thing you said, which I think is important. It goes to this. There were seasons of small d democratic reform in our history. The post Civil War amendments that not only got rid of slavery but guaranteed the right to vote and guaranteed equality. The progressive era had a lot of reforms. I think we can think of the voting rights era as an era of reform. I think right now there is a very deep sense that democracy itself is in trouble. And I think the first act that the Pelosi new Democratic majority passed was H.R. 1, which was a comprehensive political reform bill that included, I think it was the first bill they passed. It was certainly the H.R. 1, which was about campaign finance reform and the gerrymander and voting rights. And I think, just to go back to earlier conversation, you're going to hear discussions of court reform, court expansion as part of this democracy argument. So that, yeah, I think democracy itself is under debate in a way it's not been, because I think people are seeing real problems in the democracy that they hadn't seen 20 years ago, but they are very vital now, also with the Supreme Court throwing out the Voting Rights Act. These issues, I think, are very close to the bone for a lot of people right now.
If I could just say one other thing, Karen, about your interest in ballot initiatives, and going back to the 2004, that was a presidential election year, and the ballot initiatives on gay marriage, the anti-gay marriage ballot initiatives in several states, were also very powerful get out the vote tools for the Republican Party. And I think it's thought that it was kind of crucial to winning Ohio, which was crucial to Bush winning the election. And that using that as a tool presumes that there are a lot of people out there at the time, Republicans, that cared a lot more about gay marriage than they did about George Bush. And all of these initiatives that we're talking about now are very important and interesting, but everybody's so completely obsessed with the top of the ticket. It's hard to see that they need a ballot initiative to boost turnout.
And it can go the other direction too. A lot of people in California in 2008 who voted for Barack Obama voted for Proposition 8. So that turnout can make a big difference in both directions.
So Joe Biden, and we're not predicting, but let's just go ahead and do the hypothetical scenario. Joe Biden takes office at the age of 78, which makes him, by a fairly long shot, the oldest president ever to take office. He has spoken of himself as a transitional figure. He does not discourage the idea that he would only be a one-term president. The fact that he has put a woman of color on his ticket would seem to sort of position Kamala Harris in kind of a pole position to be potentially the first woman president. But when he speaks of himself as a transitional figure, that kind of sounds like small ball. But given the challenges that he would be facing, whether with both the coronavirus and the economy, given if there is a Democratic majority in the United States Senate, they are talking about doing things like adding seats to the Supreme Court, getting rid of the filibuster. Would this, if in fact all the levers of power in Washington are once again placed in Democratic hands, are we going to see a burst of sort of left-leaning activism, or do you see it as something more cautious?
Well, if past is prologue from the previous administration that Biden is a part of, I think this idea that everything will change after his inauguration is really short-sighted. I mean, if you look at the first term of the Obama administration, there was one major goal that was passed, and that was Obamacare. I mean, it was a big one, but there was one. I mean, we thought we were going to get immigration reform, tax reform, all these different infrastructure, all this. None of that happened, and Democrats were in control at that point too. Now, think about all that has to be changed. I mean, yes, you talked about the battle of this pandemic that is continuing to rage, the resulting economic impact. You have to talk about foreign policy, redoing the State Department, bolstering up the intelligence community after so many defections. You're talking about, reforming education. There's still infrastructure that needs to be done. I mean, I don't know who would want this job. I mean, God bless Joe Biden. It's an immense job if the Democrat wins, even if the Democrats are in control of Congress, even if the Democrat and you have a Democrat in the White House. Keep in mind also, you have Democrats who do not agree with what to do about healthcare reform, do not agree with what to do about climate change. So this whole idea that, he'll just be a transition president, in 4 years, he'll hand it off to someone else. What that means is that in 4 years, we'll have essentially another open election, which if you think that the state of politics will have been fixed after 4 years away from from a Trump administration, I mean, I just think that that's really naive. I think that it's going to be a much bumpier road than Democrats realize, even if they have a clean sweep after this election.
I agree it'll be bumpy, but I actually think it could be very substantial simply because the times demand so much at this period. And that, when FDR got elected, he ran in 1932 as a pretty conservative candidate in certain respects. He gave certain hints that he might do something like the New Deal, but people did not anticipate this. And I think Biden, from everything I can pick up, even though he is a middle of the roader in his gut, understands that with unemployment at this level, with the pandemic causing the damage it did, with the demand for racial justice being what it is, with the problems of the healthcare system being what they are, I think you're going to see an effort to have a much bigger program than you had at the beginning of the Obama years. I think that's exactly the right comparison. And I think that Biden and the Democrats want to go beyond what they did there. It doesn't necessarily make it left wing. It'll be progressive. They're not going to pass single payer health care, but they could very well give everybody health coverage. They're not going to send everybody to college free, but they could well expand access to college and post-secondary training. And Biden's got a program that is kind of brings together the wings of the party. And so I agree. I could list all kinds of things, and in 2 years we'd sit down together and see a bunch of them went down in flames. But I think this is going to be a very ambitious period if they take the whole thing. I'm curious what Janet, who has covered the Hill longer than a lot of folks, knows the Hill. I should put it differently: knows the Hill better than almost anybody. What do you think? Going in.
Well, that the answer to the question depends a lot on how many Democrats get elected to the Senate. If they have a 51 vote margin, it's going to be very hard to get anything done, let alone big ambitious things. But when Biden talks about himself as a transitional leader, you notice he actually hasn't said that much recently, because I think that was a message to his own party. I know I'm not the guy that you want leading you deep into the future. I'm a transitional party leader. But he talks about himself as a president when he talks about himself as a president of the whole country, he compares himself to FDR, who was clearly not a transitional figure. So I think he's acknowledging a reality about his place in the party, which I think you're right that Kamala Harris is now in the pole position to be possibly the next president, but she sure is not going to get that without a fight. And part of the fight is that she's seen by the progressive wing of the party as not progressive enough, and probably 4 years as his vice president won't do much to burnish her credentials from the left. So I actually think that Election Day will be the opening whistle for the fight within the Democratic Party about how progressive they're going to be. How much they can accomplish in Congress is a whole other question. But I agree fundamentally with what EJ was saying, which is that compared to Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden is status quo, centrist, kind of incremental. But compared to even Barack Obama, he's proposing much more ambitious things. And really, if he's going to do the two things he has to do to be able to clear the way for any kind of an agenda, he has to, beat the virus and and boost the economy. And those things are not going to happen with small, incremental, boring measures. So he has to hold, and then beyond that, will he have any political capital left to get, say, the public option, which is the kind of the add-on to Obamacare that he's advocated? Well, that's not Medicare for all, but it was so radical that when they were doing the Affordable Care Act in the first place, Congress couldn't swallow a public option. Now that seems like the incremental move. So it's kind of like the Overton window has moved within the Democratic Party and in public policy debate in general.
Well, I am right now, I have been monitoring. We have so many questions coming in from our audience. And so I wanted to sort of switch over to some of the things that people are asking about. And again, thank you so much to our audience for being part of all of this. There are a lot of them about the media itself. And let's just for this, because you say the word media these days, but let's just say basically legacy news organizations, cable news, network news, just the kind of traditional definitions of the media. Did we learn from our mistakes in 2016? Are we doing a better job this time around? And what mistakes are we making this time?
It's so funny. Everybody wanted to jump on your questions when you asked them about politicians, but when you ask about the media, we are suddenly.
I'll start. Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
What I think our big failure in the Trump era, where we have this president who can make the weather. He can create the news cycle with some controversy that didn't exist 5 minutes ago and that nobody's going to remember by day after tomorrow. But he is able to make the media go into a complete frenzy over some offhand comment. I think that we are not doing a good enough job, not doing nearly a good enough job, helping our readers, helping our viewers sort out of all of these controversies what's important and what isn't. I mean, I've often thought about social media, and it has this tendency to make large objects look small and small objects look big. And so I think that it's not necessarily a campaign failure, but it is a failure, I think, of a lot of us. We go chasing after every rabbit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
What I was going to say is I've always joked that Trump's secret is he is the only politician in history who fends off one scandal with a new scandal. And it is really quite remarkable how what you say, Karen, is 100% true, which is he can throw it's not even an issue, just some comment out there, and that becomes the center for a while, and then we move on. But it's also true that there were so many outrages and questionable things that happen. They happen at such speed that there is very little focus on any one of them. I think that was key in the 2016 campaign. I think the real question for us is, what do we learn? Trump, I think and hope, is sui generis, that there will never be anyone quite like Trump. But I think there will be Trumpism, and I think there will be efforts to use the media in manipulative ways. I mean, we had McCarthy, after all, and some of this sometimes has sort of a feeling of that sort of era. And the other thing is just false equivalence. There are not first of all, on many issues, there are more than two sides. But on many facts, there's only one side, which is the fact itself. And the rest of it is made up. And I think we've struggled with that and made some progress with that, but not enough. I think there is still too much worry that you can't say, no, this is true, and what that person is saying is flatly false. And you have it with our fact checkers, God bless it, but I think it needs to be a much more central part of what we do.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to focus in on one area, which I think is important, is, and hopefully as a result of our conversations about equality and diversity and having a broader point of view that's happening in our newsrooms, it would continue to change. But I think there was, I mean, when you talk about the media, and I'm very glad, Karen, that you defined it, because it really bothers me when people talk about the media and it's like, okay, talk about who you're talking about specifically. Are you talking about a story? Are you talking about cable news? What are you talking about? Because I know as a journalist, for me, I and a lot of my colleagues in 2016 were talking about a lot of things that others were not, including the role of race and racism in the election of 2016. This idea of economic anxiety, which I and a lot of other journalists identified the racial and xenophobic aspects of that in real time, which now is coming to the fore, of course, now that the president is doing things like telling right-leaning white supremacist organizations to stand by. It seems very clear, but this was a long time in coming. And that wasn't really pointed out. And we gave a lot of folks a pass, including voters, a pass in supporting Donald Trump based on this fear of immigrants coming into our country, Muslims, enacting Sharia law, Black people who are violent and destroying our inner cities. This is not something that came up in 2020. That all existed in 2016 and wasn't really called out or analyzed by the media broadly the way that it is doing so now. So in some ways, I'd look back and say, I did a better job perhaps than most journalists did at that time, and people are still catching up. That, of course, is still a big, major issue. I think just as big, we talked about the death of George Floyd in May, bringing all of this to the fore. That is, when you talk about a motivating factor, and one reason why you were seeing a lot of people standing for 4, 6, 8, 10 hours to cast a vote. That is a big issue that they're seeing. This is a new civil rights era that is taking place right in front of our eyes. Again, not just on the issue of criminal justice reform, but on the issue of equality in a host of ways. I think one of the biggest one of the biggest demographics that we were talking about, that after the election, we saw that Trump won white women, the majority of white women voters, which he likes to tout that he won women. He didn't win women, he won white women, which is him erasing women of color again. But now you're seeing these women, a lot of white women in suburbs, in exurbs, holding up Black Lives Matter signs, that this is a shift. And it's in part because of the media coverage of these issues that there has been a shift on the part of voters. So I think just having more diverse media in our newsrooms, paying more attention to local media across the country, so that is not a coastal centric view of the election, particularly in cable news. These are things that are changing for the better. There's still a lot of work to do, but it just underscores the importance of that geographic diversity, age diversity, in looking at these issues that can paint a clearer picture of what's happening in real time, so that we don't have to look back at what was missed.
And yet we have Trump, talking to what he calls suburban housewives, heavy, law and order, they're coming to destroy your suburbs. I mean, it's just essentially a message out of 1968. Is it working?
Well, actually, can I just say one thing about Trump and his communications and what it's done to the media? And I'll end up answering your question, but it struck me, this whole reflection on whether we're doing a good job or not, whether we're replicating mistakes, moving beyond, reminds me of how much Trump has changed the way the president communicates and how we cover him. Because I do remember clearly at the beginning of his presidency, there was this thought that, oh, well, now that he's president, he'll stop tweeting. So then he did not stop tweeting. And I remember the first time an editor came to me and said, Trump just tweeted this, write a story about that. And I said something like, I'm not going to write a story about one tweet. Well, that didn't last long. And that gets to the kinds of distortions that you were talking about, of him being able to throw anything out there, and it distracts us for the news cycle. And it takes a lot of discipline kind of with the pressures of, kind of digital news publications. And the other issue that I think is really important that both Kimberly and EJ brought up is, what is the truth? We are about not propagating lies. We are about writing what is true. And we have a president who challenges us every day. And I remember back in the days when I covered Congress, there were lots of people you could quote in any given story, kind of speaking on the same issue. And whenever somebody lied or sort of had a quote in it that was quote that was factually inaccurate, I just said, I'm not going to include any quotes that aren't true, because it's too much trouble to fact check in real time. But with the president of the United States, you have to choose. Do you quote him? Do you let people know what he said and fact check him? Or do you not perpetuate the lie? I mean, it's just sort of a daily challenge that we have to juggle. And I'm not so sure I ever know what the right answer is. But,
well, one thing that this president has done too, I think, with his base is foster a rejection of scientific knowledge, of expertise. We see this not only with the pandemic, but we see it, for instance, with climate change, which is an issue that is in a lot of our questions here, where the West is literally on fire, and he is not accepting the consensus of scientists that human beings have an influence on changes in the climate that are causing very severe weather events. Is that going? I mean, do you think that we've sort of crossed a bridge on that, or can the country sort of be pulled back and back into a place where people want to hear from experts and scientists and want to know those facts and truths?
Well, I think climate and the pandemic are different. I think that climate denialism predates Trump, and that I think that you had a brief period where you actually had a genuine bipartisan discussion on climate, where you had some Republicans like John McCain, like Bob Corker for a bit, saying, yeah, this is a problem with human cause and we have to do something about it. Starting about, 8-10 years ago, the power of all of the extractive industries, coal, oil, and the like in the Republican Party was such that you couldn't just take that position anymore as a Republican. And denialism became a whole industry. And it was a tricky thing for the press, because if 1% or 2% of scientists said this, and 99 or 98% said this, often they were quoted, one quote from one side, one quote from the other side, which is a real problem when there is an overwhelming consensus. Now, the press actually, I think, sort of has dealt with that. There are a lot of newspapers, including the Post, that have a certain style thing on what you have to say about climate because of the facts. And I think you might begin to see a change on climate because the younger generation is so focused on it. And if you want to win a vote from anybody under 35 or 40, you shouldn't be a climate denier. It's not going to work for very much longer. I think on the virus, it was just a really wacky marriage of Trump himself and a strange libertarianism that saw mask wearing as the right not to wear a mask in public as a fundamental right, as opposed to your right and my right not to get infected by someone, and our obligation not to infect people. So I think with the virus, it was just a very peculiar and unfortunate turn of events that Donald Trump ended up making some of the choices he did, because I don't even think they were ever politically either necessary or helpful to him, but he did.
So on climate change, like two really remarkable things have happened over the last 4 years. One is the attack on science that suddenly, the consensus of, that Republicans are so willing to attack a scientific consensus or operate in opposition to it. The other is the emergence of climate change as a top issue. I mean, really, in 2016 and in earlier elections, it was really kind of a boutique thing, and it was to the great, frustration of climate activists. And especially before the coronavirus kind of swamped everything, it was really a huge issue in the Democratic primary. And it was kind of mind blowing. And it's just hard to remember that. And, part of it is just, facts are emerging that make people see that it's something that has to be addressed.
Well, Janet, you had mentioned that, and again, we are going to put this out here as not a prediction, but just a frame of reference here, assuming the Democrats win. You had talked about how there are going to be strains within the party, how far to go left, how aggressive to be, how activist to be. If the Democrats win, we have a question here. What happens to the Republicans? And will they be more eager to cooperate with the Democrats after this? What do you think is left of the Republican Party?
Well, so Trump may be defeated, but Trumpism will linger, that a lot of these Republicans have kind of changed their stripes and kind of are now running and being supported by the same kind of base that elected Trump. And I think that Congress as an institution has completely lost the capacity to operate in a bipartisan way. And I think that's actually one of the big gripes that progressive Democrats in general, but progressive Democrats in particular, think that Biden is, on another planet if he thinks that he can get Republicans to cooperate with him. And so I think the Republicans, I think actually both parties, almost no matter what the outcome of the election, well, no, let's say if Biden wins, whatever happens in the Senate, I think both parties are going to undergo a real kind of identity crisis or sort of an internal debate about what they're about in the wake of it. If Trump's defeated, the party has to say, okay, well, if we're not the party of Trump, what are we? And Democrats, like I say, the remarkable thing about this general election, remarkable, is how unified the party has been, that the progressives, Biden was not the first choice of the progressives. They were with Warren or Bernie, and they have been quiet as a mouse, incredibly disciplined, and sort of staying focused on we have to hang together to defeat Trump. There's sort of this journalistic kind of cliche about Democrats being in disarray. Well, right now we can say Democrats are in array.
It took Donald Trump.
Best Democratic organizer ever.
I think to expect the Republicans to work with Biden is like expecting a stadium full of people at Fenway Park to root for the Yankees. It's just not going to happen. And I think Biden's going to make a lot of showy efforts, which he should. He's going to invite a lot of Republicans to the White House. He's going to hope that one or two might go along with this or that. But I think that opposition will be the only thing that can keep them together, because I do think you're going to have an interesting debate on their side where you're going to have sort of Trumpist kind of politics, Tom Cotton being representative of that, a kind of neo-Reagan politics, somebody like Ben Sass being representative of that. You've got some interesting stuff happening with Rubio and Josh Hawley, where they've been more critical of capitalism. So they're trying to stake out some other ground. Hawley is sort of a Trumpist, but more of an economic populist. And Rubio is more of a Reaganite, but also has started talking populism. So I think you're going to have a genuinely interesting debate below the surface, but I can't imagine there are going to be very many ready to work with Joe Biden, which is unfortunate, but I just don't see it.
Yeah, I think that that's true. And I think one thing to Janet's point, which I think is very true, that Trumpism will not go away, even if Donald Trump loses the election, is just how Trumpified, that's a word I've made up in the last year or so, how Trumpified state GOP, the GOP in several states has become. Even Massachusetts, where my paper is located, the fact that state's GOP has become so Trumpified that they stand in polar opposite and at loggerheads with the Republican governor is just a mystifying thing that has happened. And it's happened in states across the country, that it's had this very, MAGA will live on after Trump in politics at not only the national level, but at the state and local level too. And so there is a real, I mean, it's an overused phrase, but there's a real civil war happening within the Republican Party right now, where there's also still all the conservatives that have left or are not actively participating in the Republican Party. They're still there. They're still conservatives. We don't know what becomes of them. So I think it's a big question mark, exactly what becomes of Republicans after this. And I think that EJ is right and Janet is right that in a weird way, Donald Trump has unified Democrats. We talked so long about, the civil war happening among Democrats. Donald Trump has been a unifying factor for them.
And as EJ has pointed out, not just Republicanism, but conservatism, because there is really so much about Donald Trump that has been embraced by the Republican Party that is not conservative. That's actually quite radical.
At all, yeah.
And that's what's going to be interesting about the never Trump conservatives. I think of them a lot like the old neoconservatives who rebelled against liberalism. And I think looking at that array of people whom I really respect for breaking ranks, I have to say, I think some of them will want to return to being conservatives. I think some of them have actually are on a journey that seems to be taking them to the other side of politics. It's amazing reading Bill Kristol's Twitter feed or our colleague Jen Rubin, for example. And then some are in some middle place. I just think that what happens to that movement after the election is going to be fascinating to watch, both politically, because I think it might matter, but also intellectually, because I think a lot of people are thinking through where they really stand in American politics.
So can we game out a little bit more about elections? I love Kim, election season, sort of how it could play out, because a lot of these early votes, absentees, these mail-in votes are not going, they're likely to lean heavily Democratic traditionally. And this year, I think Democrats are more likely than Republicans to vote early, vote absentee, which means in a lot of states, they won't be counted on election night. They will, that Trump could be a lot closer on election night than he ends up being. But now this was a question asked for EJ, but I'd love to invite you all to engage this. What if, as has happened twice in the past 20 years, the popular vote goes one way and the Electoral College goes the other way? Do you think the Electoral College needs to go?
Yeah, I've thought the Electoral College has needed to go for a very long time. I mean, it doesn't serve its original function. The way electoral votes work, part of the original function was to overrepresent the South at a time when it was the slave South, and that it's a terrible system, and it's going to get worse because more and more people are being concentrated in a few states. It's got the same problem as the U.S. Senate has. By 2040, 70% of us will live in 15 states, which means 70% of the population will have 30 senators. So we're going to have these disjunctions between the Electoral College and the popular vote more and more often. I mean, this is a lot. We hadn't had this happen before until the 1880s. It took it had happened twice now. It's been a long time since this happened. So yes, I just want to say maybe it won't be so bad on election night in terms of the count. In other words, on the one hand, I think the job of media and everybody else is to prepare people for the fact that it could well take a long time, and that doesn't mean the election's being stolen because we have unprecedented number of mail ballots. The good news, I think, about all the Trump attacks on the election and all of our worries about them is a lot of states are better prepared for this than they would have been if everybody hadn't been worried to death. And I think a lot of localities have taken some pretty big steps to try to get the vote counted fast, to try wherever the law allowed them to at least begin splitting open the envelope so that you can begin the process of counting the votes as early as possible. So on the one hand, we should be prepared, but I'm starting to think it might not be as crazy as we think, unless the election is really close and it comes down to Pennsylvania. And that's a state where everything is so tangled in litigation. That will be your mess, as if everything depends on Pennsylvania.
Well, I'm
Yeah,
Ron Brownstein, who, when we were talking in May, was absolutely obsessed with Arizona and specifically Maricopa County.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
yes,
no, it makes sense. And that is key to
Arizona.
winning Arizona. Go ahead.
yeah. I mean,
It all coming down to Pennsylvania is a really good guess, EJ, because of all of the three upper Midwest states, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania has the most electoral college votes, and basically, if Trump wins Pennsylvania and wins everything else that he had in 2016, he could still lose the other two states and still win. So that's
electoral vote majority.
Well,
I think
yes.
it's a 2 electoral vote majority,
Right.
which I think will raise real questions about the electoral college, by the way, if he loses the popular vote by 5 or 6 million. But go on, Janet. Yeah.
No, but actually on the electoral college, I think for people who want to change the electoral college, this would be the best thing that could happen to them, because having 3 elections decided in that lopsided way inside of a quarter century. I mean, short of some calamity like that, though, I think that the institutional forces that put it in place will keep it from changing. But I mean, just my head explodes to think of how people will react, because
I'm sure that the Supreme Court, with or without the new justice on it, the last thing they want is for one of these Florida situations to come to them. They will all demand to be put in the witness protection program.
Yes.
right. Yeah. No, the Supreme Court isn't going to want to be the decider. I mean, literally, as we're talking, my phone is blinking that the Supreme Court gave, in this ongoing litigation in Pennsylvania, gave Democrats an incremental victory in the letting. It said that it will allow votes to be counted past election day in Pennsylvania. But that's the problem, right? Like, we have these, this is what the election could vote on. And I think I agree with what everyone has said. There are some states like Florida, the folks in Florida are assuring me that they have a process in place to count the votes quickly. So if it comes down to Florida, then we may have a result, even if we definitely won't have a count on election night, but that at least we may know whether a candidate has gotten to 270 or not, if it depends on Florida. But then again, in Pennsylvania, it's something different. As for the Electoral College, keep in mind, there are a lot of, it's not just the Electoral College stays or goes, there are a lot of other incremental reforms that can take place. You can get rid of winner-take-all states and make it all proportionate. You can pass laws that vow the electors to vote in a way that is more representative to what the majority in a state and the majority in a nation has come to. So I think things like that, I think we may see happen. I think it will be difficult just to throw out the Electoral College entirely and get a real consensus behind doing that, particularly if it just looks like it's a reaction to the last election. I think there are a lot of conversations that could be had about broader election results. But yeah, I mean, I think, again, with the hypersensitivity about the US Supreme Court that we have seen from this last confirmation fight, I don't think the Supreme Court wants to be in a 2000 Bush v. Gore situation again. And I think part of the reason that you're seeing these, incremental decisions is to try to clear the path so that that doesn't happen on the end of election season as opposed to election night.
If Barrett is confirmed, 3 of the 9 justices will have been lawyers on George W. Bush's campaign in their fight over Florida in Bush v. Gore, which is astounding.
Fair point.
And one more question. We just have a few minutes left, but it's a real concern. Is it going to be safe for people to vote?
I think that's an important point to consider. I mean, you have a president who is literally calling out on people to go watch the polls, which, if you are listening to this, voter intimidation is illegal. It is a federal crime. Do not intimidate voters at polling places. You also have, in places like Virginia, the governor gave localities more more leeway to do things like ban firearms in public places, including polling places. I noticed this because I looked it up after I was walking my dog in Arlington, Virginia, and saw all these signs in parks that said firearms are not allowed here, and wondering why. Was there a problem with firearms in parks? It's because they want to ban firearms even if you have a concealed license in public places, including polling places. I mean, these are the things that lawmakers from local and on up are considering because there are threats of that. It's incredible that we have to think about these things. A lot of civil rights organizations are trying to be vigilant to give voters the information that they need if they are harassed. We've already seen some incidents where voters were approached by people from the Trump, not the Trump campaign, but Trump supporters in places where there was largely blue districts in Virginia. So it's something that needs to be considered. You can't cast that aside. And I think just as our editorial board in our voter guide that we put out and having a voter plan, being aware that voter intimidation is illegal, what to do, who to notify if you see it, and to call 911 if you feel that you're in danger. And it's incredible that we have to say that, but it's important.
Yeah, and the other question is whether people are going to be safe health-wise. And there, I think we have to give election officials a lot of credit because they've worked really hard to kind of devise alternatives to voting in person on election day. And I have to say, one of the most moving things that I saw earlier on this year was there was a special election, I think, in Wisconsin, right, like smack in the middle of the worst at the beginning of the pandemic. Yeah. And the Republicans kept them from postponing it. And so the lines of people waiting to vote, and they were socially distanced, they were wearing masks. I mean, I think that voters know what's good for them. And I think that's a big part of why we see so many people voting early or voting, by mail. And hopefully that'll minimize the health risk that people face.
I think it could end up being a political mistake that Trump made on the early balloting, because Democrats are voting in larger numbers, won't have to go on election day. And if there is if the COVID numbers keep rising, there may well be people reluctant to go vote. In Wisconsin, the Republicans, for really the first time in that election that Janet referenced during the primaries, lost a judge race by quite a lot, because for the first time they didn't really have the mail ballot advantage, so that the Democrats could switch the advantage on that form of voting because of the president's statements. It's driven a lot of Republican organizers crazy because they know it's going to hurt them.
Well, amazingly enough, an hour and a half has gone by here, and we've had so much to talk about and so many things we didn't even get to. And I apologize for that. Foreign policy, there's an entire world out there that we have not talked about. But I do want to thank the Kennedy Library for setting this up and for sponsoring us. I want to thank my fellow panelists, Janet, Kim, EJ. And I think most of all, I want to thank our audience for joining us and being part of this conversation tonight. So get out there and vote, stay safe, wear a mask, and we hope to see you again. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Karen.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.